Have you ever wondered how silence falls after the loudest war in history? Maybe you're listening late at night, tucked under soft blankets, hoping to drift into sleep, but your mind still wanders across time. Tonight, we'll follow quiet footsteps through one of the noisiest stories humanity ever told. This is not just about guns and generals. It's about bridges lost in fog, letters burned in secret, cities flattened into whispers, and the soft sound of boots marching toward the unknown. You might be joining us from Karachi, London, or a quiet village somewhere near a window. Wherever you are, welcome, and don't worry, this will be gentle. Together, we'll explore World War II not through explosions, but through strange rituals, quiet betrayals, and the haunting silence that always followed. From snow-covered forests to island caves, we'll move slowly, tenderly. Subscribe to our channel so we can walk this quiet path again, one chapter at a time. Those ships, gliding out beneath cloudy skies and silent crowds, carried more than soldiers. They carried the weight of treaties, inked in haste, and hopes written on fragile paper. Europe had signed too many promises, most of them already broken. Poland believed in Britain and France, but when the German tanks rolled in that September morning, the support came not in steel or men but in declarations read into microphones. Germany's blitzkrieg wasn't just force, it was choreography. Planes painted the sky with dread. Armored divisions slashed through fields and forests like lightning on dry land, and radios spread fear faster than armies. Poland fell in weeks, not months, while civilians fled in wagons, shoes wrapped in cloth, trying to outrun maps being redrawn in real time. Stalin moved too quietly, confidently, swallowing the East as if it were a desert promised to him in secret. The Molotov-Ribbentrop pact, a handshake between devils, had carved Poland like bread at a war table. Britain and France, stunned, waited behind the Maginot Line, soldiers huddled in frozen trenches with nothing to fire at. The phony war, they called it, months of stillness and snow, as if war had changed its mind. But it hadn't. It was merely winding up. Norway, Denmark, then the Low Countries fell like dominoes, and France proud, scarred France crumbled beneath the weight of panzers and betrayal. Paris was taken without a true fight, as old men wept and church bells fell silent. Meanwhile, across the Channel, Britain stood alone. Children were evacuated from London. Blackout curtains turned cities into shadows. And still, governments met around tables, drawing borders on maps that meant nothing to the bombs above. Promises had been made to Poland, to peace, to the memory of the last war, but none could stop the storm now. The paper curled in the heat of invasion, its words turning to ash as new lines were drawn, not in ink, but in fire. Those ships, gliding out beneath cloudy skies and silent crowds, carried more than soldiers. They carried the weight of treaties, inked in haste, and hopes written on fragile paper. Europe had signed too many promises, most of them already broken. Poland believed in Britain and France, but when the German tanks rolled in that September morning, the support came not in steel or men but in declarations read into microphones. Germany's blitzkrieg wasn't just force, it was choreography. Planes painted the sky with dread. Armored divisions slashed through fields and forests like lightning on dry land, and radios spread fear faster than armies. Poland fell in weeks, not months, while civilians fled in wagons, shoes wrapped in cloth, trying to outrun maps being redrawn in real time. Stalin moved too quietly, confidently, swallowing the East as if it were a desert promised to him in secret. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a handshake between devils, had carved Poland like bread at a war table. Britain and France, stunned, waited behind the Maginot Line, soldiers huddled in frozen trenches with nothing to fire at. The phony war, they called it months of stillness and snow, as if war had changed its mind. But it hadn't. It was merely winding up. Norway, Denmark, then the Low Countries fell like dominoes, and France browed scarred France crumbled beneath the weight of panzers and betrayal. Paris was taken without a true fight, as old men wept and church bells fell silent. Meanwhile, across the Channel, Britain stood alone. Children were evacuated from London. Blackout curtains turned cities into shadows. And still, governments met around tables, drawing borders on maps that meant nothing to the bombs above. Promises had been made to Poland, to peace, to the memory of the last war, but none could stop the storm now. The paper curled in the heat of invasion, its words turning to ash as new lines were drawn, not in ink, but in fire. And so, the fire came falling, not from dragons or angry gods, but from cold, silver machines buzzing above rooftops like hornets in the night. The Blitz began, not with a single siren, but with hundreds, echoing through London's narrow lanes. As families scrambled for basements and blankets, clutching photographs more tightly than food. The Luftwaffe's bombs did not discriminate. They struck bakeries and chapels, hospitals and playgrounds, smearing the familiar into rubble. By day, children played among craters, too young to understand that the sky had turned against them. By night, the city glowed a red pulse on the horizon that could be seen for miles, like a giant's embered breath. And still, life went on. Milkmen delivered through smoke. Firemen passed buckets in chains of soot-stained silence. Churchill's voice poured through wireless radios like an old father refusing to surrender, his growl steadier than any wall. Across Britain, airfields buzzed with young pilots barely out of school, climbing into Spitfires and Hurricanes with scarves tucked at the collar, chasing enemy shadows in dances of smoke and flame above the clouds. They called them the few, and rightly so, because those few held the line when the rest of the continent had collapsed. Meanwhile, in the countryside, evacuee children traced maps of Europe with trembling fingers, asking which cities were still ours. Their mothers knit wool in silence, and far across the sea, America watched, uncertain whether it should speak or keep pretending the sky wasn't cracking. For now, the island held, and the fires eventually faded into ash, but the air still hummed with tension like a drawn bowstring. Because while London buried its dead and swept its streets, Hitler turned east, preparing for a campaign older than politics and deeper than revenge. The next storm would not fall from the sky. It would crawl across the land, armored and brutal, toward a frozen frontier that had swallowed empires before and would again. That frontier vast, frozen, and steeped in the ghosts of fallen legions, silently as German tanks rolled toward it under the summer sun, their engines humming a hymn of overconfidence. Operation Barbarossa, launched in June 1941, was not just a military strike, it was an ideological crusade, a war to annihilate, not conquer. Hitler sent over 3 million soldiers across the border, flanked by aircraft, artillery, and ironclad certainty. At first, it worked. Soviet defenses crumbled, entire armies encircled in fields of wheat, surrendering by the hundreds of thousands. Civilians fled with what little they could carry, often nothing at all. Roads clogged with carts, cattle, and the stunned faces of farmers watching the horizon burn. Cities like Minsk and Smolensk fell quickly, their buildings turned to splinters, their men dragged away. But Russia is not measured in miles, it is measured in exhaustion. The farther the Germans advanced, the longer their supply lines stretched. The harder the mud clung to boots, the more the cold began to whisper its ancient warnings, and Stalin, silent at first, roared back with industry and sacrifice. Entire factories were dismantled and carried east by train, rebuilt in the shadow of the Urals. Women and children worked around the clock, forging tanks and bullets with frozen hands. And then came Moscow, not as a city but as symbol red walls, braced for impact, citizens digging trenches, soldiers shipped in from Siberia just as winter fell like a steel curtain. Snow froze diesel, cracked bones, silenced rifles. German troops, dressed for autumn, were buried in snowdrifts or starved in icy forests where even the birds had flown away. Yet they kept coming, pushing into scorched villages where every step was mined, every farmhouse rigged to explode. Meanwhile, in the shadows, Einsatzgruppen death squads followed the Wehrmacht, executing entire communities, bullets replacing argument. Barbarossa was no longer a campaign. It had become a curse. A slow unraveling of ambition into frostbitten, regretted though the Wehrmacht still marched east. The land itself had begun to fight back. And as the snow swallowed boots and breath in the east, something unexpected began to shift in the west, where another quiet tide had been forming, not of ice this time, but of strategy and steel. While German forces clawed desperately at the gates of Moscow, America, still officially neutral, heard the distant echo of its own name carried on explosions from the Pacific. December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. A Sunday morning turned red as Japanese aircraft dove from a clear sky, igniting. Battleships like candles. In less than 2 hours, the Pacific Fleet lay crippled, oil burning on water as sailors leaped into flame. Isolation cracked. The sleeping giants stirred. Within days, Hitler declared war on the United States, sealing a global triangle of fury. Now, with American factories humming like orchestras, fresh troops began boarding ships with uncertain eyes and chocolate bars in their pockets. In North Africa, the desert heated with battle ramels, Africa Corps dancing between sandstorms, and sabotage, until Montgomery's patient hammer broke them at El Alamein. The Americans landed in Morocco and Algeria, green and clumsy at first, but learning fast beneath a sun that spared no one. The Mediterranean, once a Roman lake, was now a graveyard of rusting metal. Sicily followed, then Italy. Mussolini captured, freed, then captured again. The Italians surrendered, but the Germans dug in. The Apennines became a staircase of blood. Monte, Cassino, Anzio towns, whose names would be remembered more for mud than for glory. Meanwhile, in the Atlantic, U-boats prowled silently, torpedoing convoys under moonless skies. Liberty ships burned, while coded messages raced through underground cables. But radar grew sharper, sonar deeper, and slowly the wolf packs were broken. On every front, the tide shifted not in a sudden wave, but in the slow, grinding turn of momentum, like a glacier, changing course. Hitler, now stretched thin, stared at maps that no longer obeyed him. And in London and Washington, a whisper began to grow louder: invasion. The question was no longer if, but when and where. The West was readying its fist, even as it held it behind its back. That hidden fist began to shape itself, not in bullets or bombs, but in shadows, clever lies, stitched into maps, dummy tanks painted to mislead, whispers planted in enemy ears to trick entire armies. Operation Bodyguard, a grand deception cloaked in quiet genius, was already unfolding months before a single boot touched sand. Fake armies, led by ghost generals, were stationed in Scotland and southern England. Inflatable vehicles parked where spies might see them, radio traffic forged with such precision that German codebreakers believed every false word. The Allies weren't just planning an invasion, they were rewriting reality. Hitler, obsessed with the Pas-de-Calais, moved his reserves away from Normandy, trusting shadows more than instincts. Meanwhile, real troops drilled in cold camps across Britain, loading into ships and gliders with the silence of men who knew the date but not their fate. The plan was monumental: 5 beachheads, thousands of vessels, paratroopers to drop behind lines, engineers to clear obstacles, medics to carry bandages through chaos. Weather became a general, its moods studied more closely than enemy reports. On June 5th, the sea swelled too harshly, postponed, but on the 6th, a window opened just wide enough for destiny to crawl through. As night swallowed the English coast, planes lifted into the black, carrying young men and their parachutes into enemy skies. Some would land miles from their targets, some would never land at all, others would fight alone in hedgerows and farmyards. Unaware they were the first blows of liberation. At dawn, the channel rippled with steel. Landing craft bobbed in uneven rhythm, packed with soldiers who recited prayers they barely remembered. Code words were whispered. Beaches had names: Noyuto, Omaha, Gold, Juno, Sword, but soon they'd have other names too. Fox, Green, Dead Man's Gulch, Red Sector, Slaughter Alley. And behind all this movement, all this silence before the deception still held. Hitler hesitated, believing that true invasion was yet to come. The fist, once hidden, was now rising, and the blow would fall not just on sand, but on everything the Reich believed unbreakable. And then it struck the blow that split the sea, turned sand to smoke, and wrote history in salt and blood. As dawn broke over Normandy on June 6, 1944, the world's largest amphibious assault surged forward with a breathless silence, broken only by the whine of landing ramps, lowering, and the crack of rifles waiting ashore. At Omaha Beach, nothing went as planned. The tide was wrong, the obstacles intact, and the cliffs above were bristling with machine guns manned by veterans who'd survived the Eastern Front. The first waves of American troops stepped into water, already red, bullets snapping through the foam before their boots touched sand. Bodies drifted, medics shouted into wind, and engineers clawed at beach defenses under mortar fire. But even in that chaos, perhaps, because of it, something happened that cannot be measured in medals or maps. They kept going, one by one, soaked, and shaking, they crawled past their fear and up those cliffs, bayonets forward, breath shallow. At Utah, paratroopers held bridges with pockets of dynamite and desperation. At Gold and Juno, British and Canadian units punched through, fighting, house by house, sword saw tanks rolling straight onto the sand, some drowned by the waves, others firing as they emerged like iron beasts. Behind them, the Mulberry Harbor, miracle of floating engineering, began assembling to feed this fragile foothold. In the hedgerows inland, the fighting only thickened. Fields once used for grazing were now torn apart by artillery and teeth. Snipers hid in barns, cows wandered through shellfire, and the smell of cordite mixed with manure and rotting crops. Liberation didn't come like a trumpetet, came like a cough, rough and choking. Still, village by village, they pushed forward. Churches, once occupied by Gestapo, became aid stations. Children peeked from cellars, holding up fingers in a V in somewhere. Far from the thunder, Hitler slept late that morning, convinced the real invasion was still to come. Normandy was bleeding, but breathing then from that breath would rise the long exhale of occupied Europe. But breathing was not the same as moving, and Normandy's next trap was silence itself, silence made of twisted hedgerows, thick with bramble and fog, where every lane turned into an ambush, and every tree could be a grave. This was the Bocage, a landscape so ancient and tangled it felt alive, choking tanks with mud and blinding infantry with green. The Germans, practiced in retreating to kill, used it with brutal brilliance. Machine guns were nested behind cow pastures, mortar buried beneath orchard trees. American G is trained for open assaults, now had to learn the language of creeping. They moved inch by inch, blowing gaps in hedgerows with explosives packed in canvas tubes. Rhino tanks with welded prongs lumbered forward, tearing through the roots like blind bulls. Each field was a fortress, each ditch a death trap. Progress was counted not in miles, but in bodies and broken wheels. Meanwhile, civilians emerged like ghosts. An old woman boiled nettles in a helmet. A boy dragged a wagon full of potatoes, past a cratered wall, eyes too old for his face. In the air, Allied planes swarmed, bombing ahead of the front lines with such force that entire villages disappeared. Church steeples snapped like twigs, and German units vanished beneath firestorms. Yet some survived, crawling up through the rubble like worms of smoke. In towns like St. Lay, nothing remained upright. Not saints, not the past. Still, the Allies pushed. Patton's tanks, once idle in England, were finally unleashed. They roared through the gap at Ivranches, breaking the German flank and pouring south like oil on fire. Resistance fighters in barracks blew up rail lines and whispered maps into Allied ears. France was waking up not all at once, not cleanly, but with blood still drying on its doorstep. And as the Germans fell back, they destroyed what they could: bridges, roads, even their own wounded. But it was too late. The tide was no longer turning, it had turned. And somewhere in Paris, a radio crackled with the sound of footsteps echoing in the metro, growing louder like history climbing the stairs. At last, those footsteps, echoing louder each night, belonged not to ghosts, but to soldiers and saboteurs, to messengers with news folded in their socks, to Parisians who dared to believe that liberation might not be a rumor this time. By late August, 1944, Paris-stents, starved and strangled by curfews, was stirring in ways the occupying forces could no longer control. The resistance had grown bolder. Police uniforms were exchanged in alleyways. Typewriters clacked out hidden pamphlets. and the city began to breathe in the rhythm of revolt. Then came the signal, an uprising. Barricades rose overnight, built from overturned cars, sandbags, and the guts of old furniture. French flags, long hidden in drawers, bloomed from balconies like defiance in cloth. German snipers took positions in cathedrals, but for the first time in years, their orders sounded thin. Then, almost suddenly, American tanks appeared at the gates. Leclerc's Free French 2nd Armored Division rolled through, cheered by crowds that wept and waved and climbed over each other just to touch the metal. Charles de Gaulle entered the city with a deliberate stride, refusing to be seen as a puppet. In Notre Dame, gunfire cracked, even as the bells rang out, and across the Seine, lovers kissed beneath clouds of smoke. But celebration walked hand in hand with silence. Collaborators were dragged into the streets, heads shaved in shame, while old vendettas were settled behind closed doors. Paris had survived the occupation, but not unscarred. Food was still scarce, streets still dangerous, and the memory of betrayal hung heavier than the flags. Yet it breathed again, cafes reopened. Children tossed balls along the same cobblestones where resistance fighters had once lain in wait. For a brief moment, the world watched the city of light flicker back to life, and in that flicker was a promise, fragile and flickering, that Europe could be whole again. But even as champagne was uncorked and music filled the ruins, the guns had not stopped. To the east, a colder war waited, its eyes set on Berlin, its fingers reaching through. Poland, Paris was free, but the war was not over. While Paris danced in the smoke of its rebirth, far to the east, Warsaw waited in silence, watching, hoping, and then rising. In August 1944, as Soviet troops approached the city's outskirts, the Polish Home Army launched its uprising against the Nazi occupiers, believing their moment had finally come. For 63 days, they fought from sewer tunnels, behind barricaded tenements, with pistols, grenades, and faith. Young boys carried messages on bicycles, women patched wounds in cellars lit by candle stubs, and citizens turned grand pianos into barricades. But the Red Army, now encamped just across the Vistula River, did not come. Stalin paused, letting the city bleed. Some said he waited for the Nazis to finish what the gulags had begun. Hitler responded with fury. He ordered Warsaw to be annihilated, block by block. Luftwaffe bombers erased hospitals. SS units dragged entire families into courtyards and opened fire without a word. Streets became mass graves. And still, the Poles resisted not for victory, but for dignity. The world watched. In disbelief, London dropped supplies, too few. Washington offered sympathy, too late. Stalin sent nothing but silence. And when the uprising finally collapsed in October, nearly 200,000 civilians were dead. What remained of Warsaw was leveled, not conquered, erased. Rubble replaced neighborhoods. Photographs became tombstones. And in that stillness, a second death occurred, one of trust. For those who had believed in Allied unity, in shared cause, this was the beginning of another kind of war. The Cold War didn't start with walls or missiles, it started here, with the sound of Russian artillery going quiet while a city screamed. Meanwhile, in the West, the Allies moved forward. Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg each step brought them closer to Germany's edge. But those victories rang hollow to the Poles, who now knew that liberation did not always mean freedom, and that sometimes Allies watched with folded arms. Warsaw had risen not to win, but to be remembered. Memory, once scorched, never heals the same. But if Warsaw had taught the world anything, it was that hope outpaces strategy, and, in September 1944, that lesson repeated itself in the skies above the Netherlands. Operation Market Garden, bold and rushed, was meant to end the war by Christmas. Allied High Command believed they could leapfrog across Holland with airborne troops and armoured columns, capturing a series of bridges that would lead them straight into the German heartland. Paratroopers would drop behind enemy lines in broad daylight, men with parachutes blooming like petals above Dutch farms, landing in orchards and canals with maps in their boots and victory in their pockets. The towns welcomed them, believing this was the end. Children offered apples. Resistance fighters emerged from hiding. But the bridges were still guarded, the rivers high, the German forces not as broken as the West had hoped. Arnhem, the final link, became a trap. British airborne units held out for days against tanks and machine guns, their radios fading into static as they ran out of ammunition and options. Reinforcements never arrived in time. The river could not be crossed. The Allies had gambled on speed and lost to stubborn geography and underestimated resistance. The phrase, "a bridge too far," entered history not as poetry, but as a confession. Elsewhere, supply lines stretched thin. German counterattacks grew bolder, and winter crept across the lowlands. Civilians, caught between front lines, starved, as cities like Antwerp and Nijmegen were shelled into misery. Liberation stalled, and behind the scenes, tensions among the Allies simmered. Patton and Montgomery bickered over fuel, strategy, and pride. The unity shown in Normandy had begun to fray at the edges. Meanwhile, deep inside Germany, Hitler dug in. He watched his generals fail, dismissed their doubts, and poured what strength remained into a coming blower, desperate, final gamble of his own. The West believed the war was nearly over, but the forests of the Ardennes whispered otherwise, and as the fog thickened and supply trucks sputtered in the snow, no one knew that the bloodiest battle for the Americans was still to come. The Ardennes spoke in silence, first dense forests under blankets of snow, roads frozen to glass, trees standing like silent witnesses to a storm still gathering. In December 1944, with most of the Allied command believing Germany had no strength left for offense, Hitler launched one last gamble. It came not with fanfare, but with sudden thunder. Artillery cracked the still air. Columns of panzers surged through the woods, and soldiers dressed in white moved like ghosts between the firs. Thus began the Battle of the Bulge, named for the deep wound it carved into Allied lines. American units, thinly spread and resting, were hit hardest. Bastogne, a crossroads town barely marked on maps, became the eye of the storm. Surrounded, short on food, fuel, and faith, the 101st Airborne dug foxholes into frozen earth and refused to move. When the Germans demanded surrender, General McAuliffe famously responded with a single word: nuts. Reinforcements clawed through snow-choked roads to reach them, and in skies once clouded with German air power, American bombers returned with vengeance. But for weeks the battle teetered. Civilians shivered in cellars, while towns changed hands by the hour. German soldiers, disguised as Americans, sowed confusion behind lines, changing road signs, spreading fear. Blood froze where it fell. Tanks stalled in icy ravines. Trees exploded from shell fire, sending splinters sharper than shrapnel. But Germany's gamble ran on fumes. They had no fuel for a long push, no reserves for a real breakthrough. Slowly, the bulge was flattened. The snow began to melt, and with it, any illusion that the Reich could recover. Yet the cost was terrible. Tens of thousands. Dead, entire villages erased, and soldiers whose faces aged a decade in a single winter. It was Germany's last Rorand when it ended. The Western Allies no longer paused. They crossed rivers and borders with fire behind them, pushing east, towards cities that still smoked in the distance. But they were not the only ones closing in. From the other side, the Red Army had risen like winter itself, colder, faster, and hungry for Berlin. And while the Allies moved from the west with thunder, from the east came a colder force, relentless, disciplined, and draped in red snow. The Soviet juggernaut, forged in Stalingrad and tempered by revenge, began its final push toward Berlin, with a vengeance that had no borders. In January 1945, the Vistula offensive shattered what remained of German defenses in Poland. Cities fell like dominoes, not because they were weak, but because the Red Army no longer stopped to breathe. Soviet tanks rolled through scorched farmland, past skeleton churches and mass graves still warm. What they found in their way camps, with chimneys still smoking, bones not yet cold, fueled their silence into fury. At Auschwitz, they did not speak. They simply opened the gates and moved on, leaving the dead with the dignity of snow. Villages had no names anymore, only numbers. And as they crossed into Germany proper, the rules changed. Soviet soldiers, many of whom had lost their entire families to German fire, now took retribution in ways that blurred justice and vengeance. Civilians hid in barns and cellars. Entire towns went dark. For the Red Army, this was not just conquest, it was reckoning. By March, they reached the Oder River, just 60 kilometers from Berlin. Stalin's marshals argued over routes, but the goal was never in question. Along the way, Prague waited. Vienna flinched. Even as Allied bombers burned Dresden into a flickering wound, the Soviets advanced, not with flames, but with weight divisions moving like glaciers, burying what stood in their path. Berlin's edges could already hear the rumble, and yet the German High Command refused to admit defeat. Hitler, increasingly delusional, issued orders to armies that no longer existed. Children were drafted into defense units. Women filled sandbags. Trenches were dug through city streets. The Third Reich was crumbling, but like a rotten tower, it threatened to collapse in every direction. And in the space between the two fronts, civilians ran out of places to run. Because when snow rises in spring, it does not melt gently. It crashes down in rivers, and those rivers were headed straight for Berlin. Berlin stood like a wounded animal as the rivers closed in Soviets from the east. Americans and British from the west, yet Hitler clung to it, not as a city, but as a final illusion. As April 1945 began, the once proud capital had become a husk of propaganda and rubble. Civilians dug trenches in Tiergarten. The SS manned checkpoints with boys too young to shave and old men too tired to flee. Women filled bottles with petrol for Molotovs, while Goebbels' voice still hissed promises of victory through radios half buried in dust. Then the shelling started. Soviet artillery opened like a curtain of thunder, waves of fire rolling toward the city's heart. Buildings crumbled into themselves. Entire neighborhoods vanished before infantry even arrived. Stalin's generals Zhukov and Konev competed, not just for victory, but for glory. Red banners were readied before the streets were even taken. Meanwhile, beneath Berlin, Hitler had retreated into a concrete tomb, his four-bunker, giving orders to divisions that no longer existed, plotting counterattacks on maps that had already burned. Above him, SS units executed deserters in alleys, while looters scoured for bread in stairwells. The Reichstag, symbol of Germany's lost democracy, became a fortress, sandbags stacked beneath statues, snipers behind its broken glass eye. As the Soviets closed in, block by block, each street became a war of its own. Machine guns versus grenades, tanks trapped in basements, civilians caught between languages of conquest. The smell of smoke never left. Hospitals overflowed, churches collapsed, and still Hitler remained underground, marrying Eva Braun in a flickering ceremony just days before their double suicide, poison and pistol curtain drawn. Their bodies were burned in the choked garden, fed to the flames as the Red Army breached the final blocks. On May 2nd, Berlin surrendered. What remained was silence and soot. Soviet soldiers wandered the streets, half in awe, half in exhaustion. The Reich was over, but the scars were fresh. In every shattered window, history looked back. The war had ended here, but peace had not yet arrived. Not in Berlin, not yet. But the silence wasn't enough. Victory needed ink, not just a shand, so the Allies demanded what history always requires, a signature. In the wake of Berlin's fall, German command fractured. Admiral Dönitz, Hitler's chosen successor, operated from the north like a man walking through smoke, offering partial surrenders to the Western Allies in hopes of stalling the Soviets. But Stalin, having lost millions, refused delay. On May 7, 1945, in a modest schoolhouse in Reims, France, Germany's General Jodl signed the unconditional surrender in front of American and British officers. Eisenhower did not attend. He said the dead already bore witness. For a moment, it was over. London erupted into cheers. Paris poured into the streets. In New York, paper rained from skyscrapers like petals of relief. But Moscow frowned. Stalin insisted the surrender be signed again, this time in Berlin, in the Soviet sector, beneath red banners and cracked ceilings. And so, on May 8th, General Keitel arrived at Karlshorst, stiff with defeat, medals heavy on a uniform that meant nothing now. Before Soviet Marshal Zhukov and Allied representatives, he signed again. 2 surrenders, 2 dates, 1 war. For the West, May 8th became V-Day, a final exhale after 6 years of held breath. Crowds danced, kissed, wept. The nightmare had ended, so they thought. In truth, the smoke had not yet cleared. Across Europe, refugee columns still stretched. Across broken roads, concentration camps lay open, filled with the living and the dying. War criminals hid among farmers and nuns. Children were born in basements to mothers who didn't remember the word safe. And in the Pacific, the sun was still burning. While Europe lit candles and rebuilt churches, Tokyo braced for firebombs, and young men in American uniforms were being trained for a land invasion far bloodier than Normandy. Germany had fallen, but war had not. The world had learned how to burn, but not yet how to heal. And in the silence between signatures, a new fear began to hum, quieter, deadlier, glowing just beyond the horizon. And while Europe wept and waltzed in the shadow of surrender, the Pacific held its breath beneath a different storm, one not of tanks and trenches, but of islands soaked in blood and skies set alight by something older than peace. Japan, encircled, yet defiant, had refused surrender. Its empire shrank, but its will held like iron bamboo. The American strategy, island hopping, had reached its cruelest stretch. At Iwo Jima, US Marines carved their way through volcanic rock and machine gun nests, raising the flag atop Mount Suribachi as more men died below. Okinawa followed, a place where civilians leaped from cliffs rather than be captured, where kamikaze pilots' boys barely past schools dared their planes into steel with prayers sewn into their sleeves. The battle was not just military, it was spiritual. Japan fought not to win, but to outlast belief. Yet the United States, exhausted from years of war, had grown tired of attrition. Something else had been forged in New Mexico, a lightless sun, a silence that shattered mountains. The Manhattan Project, once hidden beneath layers of secrecy and sand, was now ready. Truman, barely months into his presidency, faced a decision no man had ever held: unleash a weapon that could end the war, unleash a future no one could undo. On August 6, 1945, the Enola Gay dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima. In seconds, a city became a shadow. Tens of thousands vaporized, their outlines burned into bridges and walls. 3 days later, Nagasaki followed. The mushroom clouds rose like judgment. People melted, rivers boiled, skin hung in tatters from arms raised in confusion. And yet, even amid that horror, surrender did not come immediately. Japan's inner circle argued. Some still believed in fighting on. But Emperor Hirohito, silent through years of war, finally spoke. His voice, broadcast through crackling radios to a stunned nation, called for surrender not in terms of defeat, but as a means to endure the unbearable. On August 15th, Japan agreed to end the war. The world exhaled again, but the breath was different now. It tasted of ash, of radiation, of questions no surrender could answer. Victory had come, but at a cost that reshaped the very meaning of power. But peace is not the absence of fire, it is the aftermath, the sorting of bones, the long and painful decision of what justice should look like when the earth itself still does. As the world stood among the ruins, a new kind of war began, not with bullets, but with silence broken by walls. In the halls of Nuremberg, justice wore robes instead of medals. 24 high-ranking Nazi officials sat in the dock, their faces pale, sunken, not with guilt, but with the weight of history staring back at them. Judges from the Allied nations presided over what had never been done before, trying a nation's leaders not merely for losing a war, but for crimes against humanity. The evidence was not hearsay, it was film reels, photographs, names scratched into camp walls, and the brittle remains of gold teeth taken from gas chambers. The defendants claimed they were following orders, but the world had heard that excuse. Before, at Nuremberg, a new standard was born. Obedience is not innocence. Meanwhile, in Japan, the Tokyo trials began. The architects of imperial brutality, those who orchestrated the rape of Nanking, the human experiments of Unit 731, the death marches across Burma were brought forth. Emperor Hirohito, carefully shielded from prosecution, remained a symbol of unity, even as his generals stood trial. Across Europe and Asia, smaller tribunals followed, while other executions took place in forests, courtyards, or behind closed doors, where vengeance disguised itself as closure. But not all the guilty were caught. Some fled to South America. Others resumed quiet lives under different names, blending into the rubble they once helped create. Meanwhile, the survivors tried to speak. In displaced persons camps, millions waited for nations that no longer existed, for homes turned to ash. Children were born stateless, old people died nameless. The war was over, but its shape remained in every face and every silence. And in that silence, a terrible question lingered. Not just how did this happen, but what do we do now that it did? For even as justice was handed down, the world had to reckon not only with who was evil, but who had looked away. And so the victors gathered, not just to celebrate, but to carve the future, though the knife they used was diplomacy, and the flesh was the world itself. In the summer of 1945, at Potsdam, leaders who had never stood in the same room before sat around a shared table. Stalin, stoic and iron-eyed. Truman, new to the role, but carrying the weight of Hiroshima in his breast pocket. And Churchill, soon replaced mid-conference by Clement Attlee, a quiet reminder that even victors lose elections. The air in Potsdam was thick not with gunpowder, but with suspicion. They talked of peace, but every sentence carried a shadow. Germany would be divided into 4 zones: American, British, French, Soviet. Berlin, too, though broken, would be quartered like a carcass. Eastern Europe was already darkening under Soviet influence. Poland, promised one thing, received another. Romania and Hungary, too, found their choices disappearing behind red curtains. The lines drawn on maps were clean, but on the ground they bled. Refugees tried to return home, only to find borders changed, languages erased, and neighbors replaced by soldiers. In Asia, Japan was occupied, its emperor preserved as figurehead, while General MacArthur became a kind of uncrowned king, overseeing reforms, disbanding militarism, and drafting a new constitution under American gaze. Korea, hastily divided along the 38th parallel, became a fuse waiting for flame. In Palestine, tensions ignited as Holocaust survivors arrived to a land already brimming with unrest. Meanwhile, in the West, the Marshall Plan was conceived not just as charity, but as strategy. Economic aid would rebuild Europe, but also by allegiance, brick by brick. And the United Nations was born, a fragile hope stitched together from the ashes of the League before it. Yet even as nations signed treaties and shook hands, they watched each other through binoculars. Peace, it seemed, was no longer the absence of war, but the presence of preparation. The world was no longer burning, but it was kindling. And beneath the paper maps and press photos, 2 superpowers had begun circling one another, not with rifles, but with silence, science, and suspicion. But even before the ink dried on post-war treaties, a different kind of warmth crept into the bones of the Cold War, the warmth of peace, but of reactors, radiation, and rhetoric. The allies who once embraced on battlefields now sat at opposite ends of a narrowing table. The United States, alone in its nuclear shadow, spoke of freedom, while the Soviet Union, bloodied and sprawling, answered with revolution. Berlin became a split city, its eastern half slowly swallowed by grey uniforms and red stars. In 1948, Stalin tested the limits of diplomacy by blockading West Berlin, choking off all land access to force Western withdrawal. But instead of retreating, The West responded with airplanes. For nearly a year, Allied cargo, planes British, American, even Australian, filled the skies with parachutes of flour, coal, and chocolate. Children named the pilots. Families counted the engines by sound. It was not war, but it was not peace. And soon, two rival alliances emerged like mirror reflections. NATO in the West, a military pact promising defense through unity, and the Warsaw Pact in the East, a clenched fist masquerading as a handshake. Across oceans, propaganda replaced gunfire. Schools taught duck-and-cover drills. Radios hummed with coded warnings. Science raced itself into madness. By 1949, the Soviets had detonated their first atomic bomb, ending America's brief monopoly on annihilation. The balance of power shifted, not with soldiers, but with silence, each side building more, testing deeper, watching satellites rise above their borders like metal moons. And yet, amid this new tension, ordinary life struggled to return. Cities were rebuilt, rail lines reconnected, lovers reunited in stations scarred by war. But under every street, sirens waited. Under every smile, suspicion lingered. The warmth of victory had cooled into the paranoia of survival. No bullets flew, yet fear lived in every border crossing, in every newspaper, in every cloud that looked vaguely wrong. The war had ended, yes, but the peace that followed did not soothe. It whispered, it watched, and in that uneasy warmth, the cold truly began. And as the Cold War thickened like frost on a window no one dared open, the scars left behind by the last great war began to disappear, not because they healed, but because they were buried beneath routine, repression, and the silent agreements of survivors too tired to explain. Across Europe, cities wore makeup over craters. Parks replaced mass graves. Tourists snapped photos where soldiers once screamed. In Germany, the division hardened into architecture watchtowers, concrete walls, and soldiers ordered to shoot their own citizens if they fled toward hope. West Berlin sparkled with neon and jazz. East Berlin hummed with breadlines and suspicion, but neither side forgot. In Japan, the glow of Hiroshima and Nagasaki faded into textbooks, though the survivors carried their stories in skin and shadow. Children born with glassy eyes, limbs twisted by invisible heat, learned to smile without understanding why strangers stared. Veterans, too, came home and found they no longer fit. American soldiers returned to jobs and jukeboxes, but many never spoke again of what they saw in the Pacific. Soviet troops returned not to parades, but to poverty and political purges. And the civilians, the mothers, widows, orphans, and men who had simply survived learned how to speak around their pain, to carry it like a second spine. Some coped by forgetting, others by building museums, writing memoirs, creating rituals of remembrance. But millions had no words, only dreams filled with boots and smoke. The war had ended, yet its echo lingered in lullabies, in the way silence fell at dinner time, in the way some buildings were never rebuilt, not out of lack, but reverence. The 1950s and 60s brought new wars, new fears, and new headlines. But those who had lived through the Second World War carried something invisible. The knowledge that civilization could vanish in a single order, a single button, a single afternoon. And so they watched the world's new promises of freedom, of progress with quiet eyes, knowing that peace, like memory, is only real if tended to. The scars remained, tucked beneath sleeves and streets, waiting for someone to ask the right question. But most people never did. Most just moved on. And so a new generation was born not into fire, but into the soft dust it left behind. The children of dust, as some quietly called them, came into a world paved by stories their parents refused to tell. They played on streets rebuilt from ruin, walked past monuments without knowing what they mourned, and grew up beneath the watchful eyes of two superpowers trading threats like poker chips. In Europe, their schools taught dates and maps, but skipped over the screams between. In Japan, students wore uniforms beneath cherry blossoms, while their textbooks debated whether the bombings were a tragedy or necessity. In America, the children pledged allegiance under mushroom cloud murals labeled victory, never quite told how close their fathers had come to dying on a beach called Kyushu. And in Russia, the war was remembered as glory. Never grief statues rose, but names vanished. These children inherited silence like furniture, heavy, immovable, never discussed. Yet even in that hush, the past found ways to seep in. They asked questions their parents could not answer. Why does grandfather flinch at thunder? Why does mother cry when peeling potatoes in winter? Why is there a tattooed number on the arm of the man at the bakery who never smiles? Across the globe, the children of dust became the keepers of forgotten stories, not through memory, but through curiosity. Some turned to history books, others to protest, film, or poetry. Some ignored the past entirely, choosing rock and roll and transistor radios instead of graves. But no matter how far they drifted, the dust followed, because trauma is not just what happens, it's what survives. And as these children came of age, they began to shape the world in new ways, building movements for peace, revolutions for dignity, and asking, perhaps for the first time, not just how to survive war, but how to prevent it. Their questions disturbed the silence, and though they didn't know it yet, the ashes in which they were raised were not just ruins, they were seeds. And from those seeds grew something the previous generation could barely imagine. A quiet revolution, not of bullets, but of remembrance. The children of dust, now adults, began to turn toward the shadows their parents had learned to avoid. Museums opened where bunkers once groaned. Survivors, long silent, began to speak not with bitterness, but with trembling grace. In dim classrooms and late-night radio broadcasts, the stories returned. Not the kind with flags and medals, but the smaller, truer ones. The girl who hid in a chimney for days. The soldier who dropped his rifle to carry an enemy's child. The baker who kept kneading dough through air raids so neighbors could eat one last warm loaf. These stories weren't taught, they were found. Uncovered like forgotten letters in attic boxes, whispered at kitchen tables, translated across generations. In Germany, schoolchildren walked to Dachau, not as tourists, but as witnesses. In Poland, candlelight vigils glowed along barbed wire. In Japan, origami cranes became language for grief. And in France, old partisans finally told their grandchildren what really happened the night the bridge exploded. This was not a coordinated campaign, but something gentler, more persistent. War against forgetting. Governments hesitated, fearing shame, but memory cannot be buried forever. Artists painted the unspoken. Filmmakers followed ghosts through alleyways. Poets found metaphors for hunger, fear, and frostbitten silence. The gentle war of memory did not demand revenge, only truth. Yet even truth, softly told, has power. Power to break denial, to reshape policy, to ask what kind of future can grow from unspoken roots. Some resisted, insisting it was better to leave the past in its grave. But graves do not seal memory, they only concentrate it. And so, piece by piece, the long silence cracked, not with screams, but with the careful hands of those who inherited ashes and chose to plant remembrance instead. Because what is remembered can be learned from, and what is learned from might, one day, be prevented. And yet, even as remembrance bloomed like moss on old stone, the world began to hum once more with the uneasy rhythm of tension. Different uniforms, different headlines, but the same brittle edge beneath the surface. The Cold War aged into strange new forms, proxy battles in Vietnam and Korea, spies whispering in phone booths, mushroom clouds redrawn onto every child's imagination. But beneath those geopolitical tremors, a quieter question took root. How do you recognize the signs of a coming storm when your grandparents once swore, never again? The children of dust, now elders, found themselves watching history bend like smoke in a wind they could not quite name. Wars returned in smaller clothes, civil unrest, ethnic cleansing, genocides that the world watched live on television and still failed to stop. Bosnia, Rwanda, Cambodia, names that echoed differently in the ears of those who still remembered Warsaw, Balzan, Nanjing. The same maps redrawn, the same slow dehumanization, the same helpless international meetings where outrage came wrapped in polite delay. Survivors of World War II, now few in number, gave interviews from nursing homes and school auditoriums, their stories soft with age, but urgent with warning. You must pay attention, they whispered. It always starts quietly. And around them, new generations lit candles at memorials, posted quotes, shared photographs, but the world itself did not seem to listen as closely anymore. Peace had become background noise, and yet, in the hush between headlines, some remembered how storms once gathered under flags and songs and lies told with conviction. The sky never screams, first it darkens. A law changes here. A neighbor vanishes there. A history textbook gets edited. A wall is built again. And the ones who had lived through fire could see the shapes forming long before others noticed. The real gift of remembrance was not mourning the past. It was learning to hear its footsteps when they returned in different shoes. The world stood, once again, in that breathless space before the storm, not panicked, not innocent, but watching. And in that space between knowing and denial, the dust began to speak not in shouts, but in tremors, in subtle echoes that traveled through time-worn cobblestones and letters stored in attic boxes, in lullabies that were once prayers whispered. In hiding, it spoke through the stories now etched into bronze plaques outside train stations, through cracks in monuments that no longer felt like enough, through the eyes of tour guides who paused just a moment too long at the edge of preserved barbed wire. The past had no tongue, but it had memory, and memory, when refused silence, finds 1,000 mouths. Schoolchildren retraced the paths of deportation trains with folded paper in hand. Artists built installations from shoes and keys left behind. The grandchildren of perpetrators stood beside the grandchildren of victims, unsure of what to say, yet standing anyway. And slowly, the dust stopped being shame and started becoming testimony. In some cities, people gathered each November beneath flickering candles, not for spectacle, but for stillness, a collective inhaling of all that had once gone unsaid. In others, street signs were renamed not after generals, but after mothers who had smuggled children through cellars and snow. Still, resistance lingered. There were those who called it exaggeration, inconvenience, who wanted history to be clean, heroic, brief. But history had learned to wait. It did not fade, it simply paused, until another voice picked it up like a thread. And so in classrooms, in poetry slams, in film festivals and late-night kitchen tables, that thread kept moving. The dust that once choked now carved. It carved empathy. It carved vigilance. It carved strange, impossible hope. Because when you listen closely to the silence beneath any peaceful square, you begin to hear it, the gentle murmur of names once erased, the remembered weight of hunger, the soft chant of children learning not to forget. The dust, it turned out, had never settled. It had only waited for someone to ask again, what happened here? And as the dust continued to murmur, something remarkable began to take shape, not through revolution or decree, but through presence. People began to stand still in the very places where others had once disappeared. In Berlin, bronze stumbling. Stones glinted between cobblestones, each one engraved with a name, a date, and a fate small enough to miss, yet impossible to forget once noticed. In Warsaw, artists projected vanished Jewish street names onto the sides of buildings, the old map glowing faintly above the new one like a ghost's breath. In Nanking, silent walks replaced political speeches, and in Tokyo, hibakusha planted trees not to mourn, but to offer shade to generations who would never feel the heat of flame. The dust had become something living now, a quiet testimony written, not in textbooks, but in gestures. A violin played outside a former ghetto gate. A classroom took a field trip to the woods where whispers still curled around tree trunks. A mother taught her child that remembering is not about guilt, it is about guardrails. It is about making sure that the next time hatred wears a different coat, someone sees the sleeves. This was not about the past anymore. It was about the living and how they chose to carry what they'd inherited. Survivors, now frail and blinking in hospital light, began passing on their final stories, not with anger, but with urgency. Tell them we were here, they said, not to haunt, but to warn, not to accuse, but to remind. And so those who listened began to speak too, not perfectly, not always easily, but honestly. They told stories at dinner tables and in subway stations, in plays and podcasts, in photographs left unedited. The dust became breath. The breath became language. The language became echo. And the echo was a kind of promise that what happened once might not happen again. Not if enough people remembered that beneath every monument, every silence, every new spring, someone once whispered, "We were here." And someone else, years later, finally listened. And in that listening, gentle, imperfect, human, the story found its rest, not as closure, but as continuation. For history does not end in books or broadcasts. It lives in the pause before a question, in the choice to notice, in the hush that falls when names are spoken aloud. Somewhere, a visitor touches a handrail at a preserved camp and lingers. Somewhere else, a young girl watches her grandfather's eyes fill at the sound of a train whistle and does not look away. These are the quiet inheritances, not land or medals, but awareness. The war ended decades ago, but the work of its memory, its warnings, its wounds, its whispered wisdom ever does. And so if you've listened this far, you're part of that work now too, because remembering isn't a burden, it's a lantern, one we pass down, story by story, so the dark isn't as deep when it comes again. Subscribe to our channel so we can meet again next time. Other stories are also waiting for you, some heavy, some healing, but all of them, like this one, are still whispering and still worth listening to.